Ethan's throat tightened as Lena's question hung between them. He opened his mouth to respond, but found that no words would come. The silence in the diner grew heavier, pressing down on him from all sides. He glanced around, his eyes darting from table to table, searching for support or even just a sign of what to do next. But all he saw were watchful eyes, filled with curiosity, judgment, and something else he couldn't quite name. "I'll get the manager," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned abruptly, his movements stiff and mechanical, and headed toward the kitchen. Lena remained seated, her posture unyielding yet calm, as if this kind of confrontation was nothing new to her. Her eyes drifted over the other diners, some of whom quickly looked away when their gazes met. She noticed the young waitress by the counter, who seemed frozen in place, clutching a tray as though it were a lifeline. The door to the kitchen swung shut behind Ethan, and he leaned against it, exhaling sharply. His chest felt tight, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of frustration, uncertainty, and shame. He had grown up in this town, steeped in its unspoken rules and traditions. Confronting them now, even in something as small as a cup of coffee, felt like stepping into quicksand. "What's going on out there?" Tom, the manager, asked from where he stood by the prep station, his arms crossed over his chest. Paige's similar problem had not allowed her to recover fully from the surgery and had fundamentally reduced her ability to work at the office. Ethan hesitated, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "There's a woman out there. She wants to order, but He stumbled over his words, unsure how to frame the situation without sounding like a fool. "But what?" Tom's voice carried an edge of impatience. "She causing trouble?" Trevor said. "No," Ethan admitted reluctantly. "It's just... You know how some people might react." Tom sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as if warding off a headache. "Ethan, we serve food. That's our job. You don't have to agree with everyone who walks in here, but you do have to serve them. Got it?" Ethan nodded, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. Tom's words were clear, but they didn't ease the discomfort gnawing at him. When Ethan returned to the dining room, Lena hadn't moved. Her composed expression remained, though there was a flicker of something like deep anticipation, perhaps, in her gaze as he approached. The silence in the room persisted, stretching out like a taut wire, ready to snap. "Your coffee will be right out," Ethan said, his voice devoid of the sharpness it had carried earlier. "Thank you," Lena replied simply, her tone steady and unassuming. "Exit." Ethan turned toward the counter, signaling to the young waitress, who quickly poured a cup of coffee and handed it to him without a word. As he carried it back to Lena's table, his hands trembled slightly, the liquid inside threatening to spill over the rim. When he placed the cup in front of her, Lena offered him a small, polite smile. "I appreciate it," she said, her words carrying a weight that Ethan couldn't quite place. He lingered for a moment, unsure why he felt compelled to say something else. "I'm sorry if I was out of line earlier," he said finally, the words tumbling out awkwardly. Lena's gaze softened, and for the first time she seemed to relax slightly. "It's not me you owe an apology to," she said gently. "I know the truth about what happened last instant." Ethan frowned, puzzled by her response, but before he could ask what she meant, the door to the diner jingled again. A young man in a crisp navy uniform stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was tall, with broad shoulders and an air of confidence that seemed to fill the room. "Mom," the man said, his voice warm and familiar as his eyes landed on Lena. Ethan's breath caught as realization dawned. The insignia on the man's uniform was unmistakable. He was a decorated officer, a soldier who had clearly served his country with distinction. Lena smiled, her composure melting into something softer and more vulnerable. "Michael," she said, her voice carrying a mix of pride and love. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Michael crossed the diner to embrace his mother. Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing. This was the son of the woman he had just refused to serve, a man who had likely faced dangers Ethan couldn't even imagine. Michael glanced at Ethan, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Is everything okay here, Mom?" he asked, his tone polite but edged with protectiveness. Lena nodded, patting his arm. "It's fine, sweetheart. Just a little misunderstanding. We never made it to the store." Ethan felt a wave of heat rise to his face. The word misunderstanding felt too kind, too forgiving for what had transpired. "Nothing. Ethan started, his voice faltering. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I didn't know." "What?" "Doing these things to solve the riddle." The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Of course it shouldn't matter, but it had, and that was the problem. Ethan looked down, shame burning in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. Lena reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Michael's arm. "Forgiveness is a choice," she said softly, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "But understanding is a responsibility, as you may have guessed." Ethan nodded, her words cutting through him with a clarity he couldn't ignore. As he turned to walk away, the weight of the moment settled over him, leaving him with a gnawing sense that this encounter was far from over. Ethan's world had always been shaped by the unyielding expectations of his father, Roger Carter, a man as immovable as the thick oaks that lined the town square. Roger was a foreman at the local mill, a job that demanded precision and discipline. At home, he carried those same values like gospel. "Know your place," he'd bark, his voice gruff and final, whenever Ethan questioned the world beyond their small southern town. For years, Ethan internalized his father's worldview, a rigid framework that dictated who belonged and who didn't. It wasn't a matter of cruelty, Ethan told himself, but survival. His father believed the world was divided into hierarchies, each person tethered to a role by birthright or circumstance. Ethan had learned early on that defying those roles wasn't just frowned upon, it was punished. But while his father was a man of rules and structure, Ethan's mother, Grace, had been the soft voice in the cacophony of their household. She would tuck Ethan in at night, her fingers brushing his hair, and tell him stories of a kindler world, a world where people were valued for their character, not their skin or station. "It's not weakness to show compassion, Ethan," she'd whisper. But her influence was fleeting. Her quiet protests were drowned out by Roger's booming authority, leaving Ethan to absorb his father's lessons more deeply than he realized. Then there was Jake, Ethan's older brother, the embodiment of everything their father admired. Strong, disciplined, and patriotic, Jake enlisted in the Army straight out of high school, earning medals and their father's approval in equal measure. He was the family's golden child, a standard Ethan knew he could never match. When Jake returned from his deployment in the Middle East, his swagger had been replaced by a limp, his easy smile by a haunted stare. The hero Ethan had idolized was now a man wrestling with unseen demons, his nights punctuated by muffled cries and trembling hands. Roger called it weakness, refusing to acknowledge the depth of Jake's trauma. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't see weakness. He saw proof of a world that broke even its strongest. As Jake struggled, Ethan's frustration festered. He watched helplessly as the man who had once towered over him with effortless confidence now struggled to piece his life together. Jake withdrew, finding solace in long walks and evenings spent staring at nothing. Their father's disapproval only added to the weight on Jake's shoulders. Ethan's resentment, however, wasn't directed at Jake. Instead, it turned outward, fueled by a simmering anger toward a world that felt unfair and unyielding. The anger manifested in small ways at first: an eye roll at a coworker, a snide remark to a passerby. Over time, it grew into something more insidious, coloring his interactions with anyone who didn't conform to the expectations ingrained in him. Ethan carried this bitterness into every aspect of his life, even into Joe's diner. The job was a lifeline, a way to pay bills and keep his head above water, but it often felt like a prison. Each day brought new faces, travelers passing through, regulars who came for their coffee and pie. But Ethan rarely looked beyond the surface. He categorized them instinctively, assigning value based on what he'd been taught. That's why when Lena Walker walked through the door, Ethan's reaction wasn't entirely conscious. It was a reflex, an automatic response shaped by years of conditioning and frustration. Her calm demeanor, her quiet strength, they unsettled him. She didn't fit neatly into the boxes his father's teachings had constructed. But in the brief exchange with Lena, something inside Ethan shifted. Her composed challenge to his refusal to serve her, her poised gaze that met his without flinching, it all pierced the armor he'd worn for so long. And when her son Michael entered the diner, the weight of the encounter grew unbearable. Michael's presence had been a revelation, a stark contrast to Ethan's own assumptions. Here was a man who had likely faced challenges Ethan couldn't fathom, standing tall and proud beside his mother. The sight of him stirred memories of Jake, of the brother who had been broken by the world but never lost his dignity. As Ethan replayed the moments in the diner over and over in his mind, he couldn't escape the truth. His actions had been a reflection not of who Lena or Michael were, but of who he had allowed himself to become. It wasn't prejudice or policy that had guided his words. It was the bitterness he had let fester for too long. The encounter with Lena and Michael was a mirror, forcing Ethan to confront the person he saw staring back at him. For the first time, he began to question the lessons he had inherited, the rigid lines that had shaped his worldview. And though the answers didn't come easily, he felt the first stirrings of something new, a desire to understand, to change, to be better than the man his father had raised him to be. Ethan avoided Lena's gaze, his fingers gripping the order pad so tightly it might have torn under the pressure. The murmurs of the diner patrons, like a faint hum at the edges of his hearing, grew more oppressive with every second that passed. He could feel their stares, burning into him, waiting for his response. I do my job," Ethan mumbled, his words faltering. Lena's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, not one of condescension but of understanding. "Your job," she repeated, her tone gentle yet unyielding. "Tell me, young man, how far does that job require you to go? Far enough to disregard what's right?" Ethan flinched at her words, the question hitting deeper than he cared to admit. His mind raced, scrambling for a retort that would end this exchange and return things to normal. But there was no escaping it now. The room was too quiet, the weight of Lena's presence too commanding. "You don't understand," Ethan said, his voice louder than he intended. It cracked slightly under the strain. "This is how things are done here, always have been." Lena leaned back in her seat, her calm expression betraying a trace of disappointment. "And that's enough for you? To follow along because that's how it's always been?" The question was simple, yet it cut through Ethan's defenses like a blade. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. In the corner of the diner, an elderly man coughed awkwardly, breaking the silence. A young waitress standing frozen by the counter shuffled nervously as if trying to decide whether to intervene or stay invisible. Ethan started, but trailed off. His gaze darted around the room, looking for support, for some unspoken confirmation that he was doing the right thing. Instead, he found a mix of emotions etched on the faces around him: judgment, curiosity, discomfort, even a flicker of admiration for Lena's quiet courage. The tension in the air felt unbearable. Ethan turned his focus back to Lena, her calm brown eyes fixed on him, like she could see straight through his carefully constructed walls. "You think this is easy for me?" Ethan said suddenly, his voice rising, more defensive than he intended. "I'm just doing what I'm told. You don't know what it's like growing up here, being told who you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to act. This isn't about you. It's about surviving." Lena's expression softened, but the intensity of her gaze didn't waver. "And is this surviving, Ethan?" she asked quietly. "Or is it just existing in someone else's shadow?" Her words struck something inside him, stirring memories he had tried to bury. His father's booming voice, the weight of expectations he could never meet, the shadow of his brother's perfection. For a moment, he felt like a child again, unsure and powerless. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't understand," he muttered, though the conviction in his voice was already faltering. Lena straightened, her presence radiating an authority that needed no volume to command attention. "Then help me understand," she said, her voice soft yet resolute. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're not just enforcing rules, you're deciding who deserves to be treated with dignity." The silence in the diner grew heavier, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Ethan blinked, unsure of how to respond. He looked down at his order pad, the words he wanted to say tangled and trapped in his throat. His mind darted back to Jake, to the times he'd watched his brother wrestle with the unfairness of the world, trying to make sense of it. Jake had always said he fought for something better, for the chance to make things better. Damn said. But Ethan? What had he ever stood for? He began again, his voice trembling. "I don't know." Lena's expression softened further, a flicker of compassion breaking through her stoic demeanor. "It's not too late to figure it out," she said gently, "but it starts with a choice. Right here, right now." Ethan's chest tightened as her words echoed in his mind. It wasn't a challenge or a demand. It was an invitation, a chance to be more than what he had been taught, more than the limitations he had placed on himself. The room remained silent, the tension palpable as everyone waited for Ethan's next move. He swallowed hard, his grip on the order pad loosening. For the first time, he allowed himself to meet Lena's gaze fully. There was no anger in her eyes, no resentment, only a quiet strength and an unwavering belief that he could be better. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something stir within him. A spark of hope. The tension in the room deepened as the manager stepped back, his eyes darting between Lena and Ethan before retreating reluctantly. The unspoken power in Lena's calm demeanor seemed to hold everyone in place, including Ethan, who stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Lena turned her full attention back to Ethan, her gaze steady and deliberate. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the faint hum of conversation in the diner. "But sometimes trouble has a way of finding those who refuse to stay silent." Ethan's throat tightened, his fingers twitching around the now crumpled order pad. He felt exposed under her gaze, as though every excuse and justification he had ever clung to was being stripped away. He forced a brave smile. "I wasn't trying to," he began, but Lena held up a hand, her calm yet commanding presence cutting through his words. "I've got it. "You're trying to follow the rules," Lena said, finishing his sentence for him. "I get that. Rules can make things simpler, can't they? They draw lines, keep things neat and tidy." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But sometimes those rules aren't about right and wrong. Sometimes they're just about power and fear." All eyes caught my response, suddenly feeling like it was the wrong answer to the course Bible. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the way her words resonated. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't question the way things are, boy. You just do what's expected." "Fear?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. Lena nodded. "Fear of change, fear of losing control, fear of seeing the humanity in someone you were told to look down on." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He hadn't wondered, or maybe he had, but he'd buried those thoughts beneath the weight of his father's expectations and the rigid lines of the town he'd grown up in. "I'm not here to judge you, Ethan," Lena continued, her tone gentle, yet firm. "But I am asking you to think. To look past what you've been told, and ask yourself what you believe. Because one day you'll have to live with the choices you've made, not the ones someone else made for you." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. Her words hit him like a tidal wave, washing over years of ingrained habits and unspoken doubts. He thought of Jake, of the haunted look in his brother's eyes when he spoke about the things he'd seen overseas. Jake had always said that the hardest battles weren't the ones fought with weapons. They were the ones fought within. The diner was unnervingly quiet, the patrons still and attentive, as if the exchange unfolding before them held the weight of something far greater than a simple argument over a cup of coffee. "So you got an extra car and you drove flat into the cop?" "I don't know how to fix this," Ethan admitted finally, his voice breaking. Lena smiled faintly, a warmth in her expression that caught him off guard. "You start small," she said. "Sometimes, all it takes is one step in the right direction." Ethan looked down at the pad in his hand, the scribbled orders blurring in his vision. The voices of his father and brother warred in his mind, one urging him to stay the course, the other challenging him to break free. Finally, he exhaled deeply, setting the order pad down on the counter. "I'll get your coffee," he said, his voice steady this time. A ripple of movement spread through the diner as the tension began to ease. Conversations picked up again in hushed tones, though the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air. As Ethan turned toward the coffee pot, Lena's voice stopped him. "Ethan," she said, her tone soft but resolute. He glanced back at her, his heart pounding. "I see more in you than you see in yourself," she said, "and I hope you'll let that part of you grow." Her words stayed with him as he poured her coffee, the sound of the liquid filling the mug grounding him in the moment. When he returned to her table and placed the cup in front of her, something in his chest felt lighter, as if a long-buried weight had begun to lift. "Thank you," Lena said, her eyes meeting his with a gratitude that felt far more significant than the simple act of serving a cup of coffee. Ethan nodded, unable to find the words to respond. But as he walked away, he knew that something had shifted, not just in the room, but within himself. The weight of Lena's words hung in the air, silencing even the faint clatter of plates and cutlery in the diner. Ethan's hand, still resting on the counter, tightened into a fist as he struggled to maintain his composure. Something about her tone, its calm strength, its unyielding purpose, made him uneasy. Lena kept her gaze on Ethan, unflinching. "My son believed in a country where everyone was treated with dignity, no matter where they came from or what they looked like," she said, her voice unwavering. "He sacrificed more than anyone should ever have to for that belief." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. He glanced around, hoping the manager or anyone else would step in, but the room remained still. All eyes were on Lena, her presence commanding an unspoken respect that even the most skeptical onlookers couldn't ignore. "I don't talk about him much," Lena continued, her voice softening slightly. "It's too painful. But today, I feel like I need to. Because maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone understand." Ethan's chest tightened. He could sense that whatever she was about to say would strike a chord he wasn't ready to face. Lena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. She held it up for Ethan to see. A young man in a military uniform, smiling broadly despite the shadows in his eyes. "This is my son, Malcolm," she said. Ethan's breath hitched. The name sent a jolt through him, stirring a memory he couldn't quite place. "Who was a medic," Lena continued, her voice tinged with pride and sorrow. "Deployed in the thick of conflict, saving lives even when it meant risking his own. That was who he was. Selfless, brave, and always willing to do the right thing." Ethan's jaw clenched, his thoughts racing. He had heard stories about medics like Malcolm during his brother Jake's time in the Middle East. Men and women who ran toward danger, not away from it. People who gave everything, often without recognition or reward. "Do you know what he told me the last time we spoke?" Lena asked, her voice breaking slightly. Ethan shook his head, his throat too tight to respond. He said, "Mom, if we stop seeing each other as human beings, we've already lost." Her voice trembled, but her resolve remained strong. That's what he believed. That's what he died for. Ethan's heart sank. The photograph, her words, the weight of her grief, it was all too much. He thought of Jake, of the nights his brother spent staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories he couldn't share. He thought of the sacrifices soldiers like Malcolm and Jake had made, and the way people like him, people who enforced rules without question, undermined everything they fought for. Ethan began, his voice faltering. He looked at Lena, then at the photograph. "I didn't know." Lena nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I didn't expect you to," she said. "But now you do. And what you do with that knowledge is up to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the diner, watching, waiting to see what he would do. But more than that, he felt the weight of his own conscience, the undeniable truth staring him in the face. Ethan said nothing. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping under the burden of his realization. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. Lena tilted her head, studying him carefully. Ethan hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "For not seeing," he said at last. "For not understanding what people like your son stood for being part of the problem." And when he didn't stop to say more, Janet put her hand on his chest and gave him a shake. Lena's expression softened further, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "Acknowledging it is the first step," she said. "But it's not enough. Change takes action." After half a second, her image returned. Ethan nodded, his mind reeling. He thought of his father's rigid beliefs, the narrow worldview he had inherited and never questioned. He thought of Jake, of the battles his brother fought, both overseas and within himself. And he thought of Malcolm, a man he had never met, but whose legacy now felt deeply personal. "I'll do better," Ethan said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "I don't know how yet, but I will." Lena smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "That's all I can ask," she said. As Ethan watched her sip her coffee, he realized that the encounter had changed something in him. It wasn't just about serving a customer or following the rules. It was about seeing people for who they truly were and standing up for what was right. He turned to find the girls looking back at him with interested eyes, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was ready to start. Ethan's chest tightened as Lena's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. What did you say your son's name was?" Ethan's voice trembled slightly as he broke the silence. Lena's gaze softened, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "David Walker," she repeated, her tone steady. "He believed in helping anyone in need, no matter the risk to himself." His smile fell away. Lena. Ethan's stomach churned. The name sparked a memory that he had buried deep, a name Jake had whispered with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Ethan started, his words faltering. "I think Jake, my brother, might have known him." Ethan waited for Daniel to respond. Lena's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Jake Carter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. "Yes, Jake Carter. He served in the same unit as your son, didn't he?" Lena clasped her hands together, her expression a mixture of surprise and pain. "Jake was one of the last people David saved. He told me about him in his letters." Her voice wavered, but she held Ethan's gaze. "Your brother was injured during an ambush, wasn't he?" Ethan nodded again, his throat tight. "He never told us much, just that a medic risked everything to get him out alive. He said he wouldn't have made it without him." "Medic was my son," Lena said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "David didn't make it out of that ambush." Ethan's breath caught in his chest. The room seemed to spin, the din of the diner fading into the background. He had never connected the dots, never thought that the nameless hero Jake spoke of might have a story of his own. A mother, a legacy, a sacrifice that was now staring him in the face. "I'm sorry," Ethan managed, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know." Lena smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "How could you?" "It's not something your brother would have wanted to burden you with. But David, he made his choice. He knew the risks, and he accepted them because he believed in what he was doing." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as guilt and gratitude warred within him. "Jake always said that medic was the bravest person he'd ever met," he said, his voice cracking. "He never stopped talking about how selfless he was, how he put everyone else first." "David was like that," Lena said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Even as a child, he was always looking out for others. He believed that every life was worth saving, no matter the cost." Ethan looked down at the order pad in his hand, the words and numbers blurring together. He thought of all the times he had taken the easy way out, following rules without questioning them, letting prejudice guide his actions. David Walker had given everything to save lives, lives like Jake's, lives like Ethan's. And here he was, dishonoring that sacrifice by refusing to serve a cup of coffee. "I don't know what to say," Ethan admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "You don't have to say anything," Lena said gently. "But you can choose to be better. For yourself, for others, and for the legacy of people like my son." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He thought of Jake, of the nights his brother had spent wrestling with his demons, and of the man who had made it possible for Jake to come home at all. He thought of Lena, sitting before him with a quiet strength that demanded respect, and of the countless others whose stories he had never bothered to hear. "I will," he said finally, his voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "I'll do better." Lena studied him for a moment, then nodded, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. "That's all I can ask." The bell above the diner door jingled as a new customer entered, breaking the tension in the room. But for Ethan, something fundamental had shifted. As he watched Lena sip her coffee, he felt a newfound resolve take root, a determination to honor the sacrifices of those like David Walker, not just in words, but in actions. As skinny as Lena was, its presence pressing on him even here. And for the first time, he understood what it truly meant to serve. Ethan's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, the crinkling sound louder than the quiet hum of the diner around them. He could feel the weight of his own heartbeat, each thud amplifying the tension in the air. His eyes skimmed over the familiar handwriting, Jake's uneven scrawl that had always been a mix of strength and vulnerability. But this time, the words carried an unfamiliar heaviness, a truth he had never imagined. The letter detailed the ambush, the chaos of the night, and the brutal injuries that had nearly claimed Jake's life. But what hit Ethan hardest were the words that followed, the words that described the medic who had saved him. A medic who had risked everything to drag Jake from the line of fire, performing life-saving actions in the heat of battle. Never hesitating. "Black medic," Ethan read aloud, his voice thick with disbelief. He looked up at Lena, his mind struggling to process the realization. Jake wrote about him, about how this medic was the reason he survived. He said that if it hadn't been for him, he wouldn't have made it. Lena nodded, her expression calm, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "Your brother knew. He knew what my son had done, and he was forever grateful for it, as was I." Ethan's gaze shifted from the letter to Lena, the full magnitude of what she was saying sinking in. His brother had spoken of the medic, the hero, the man who had saved his life. But Ethan had always pictured him as a faceless figure, someone who was simply doing his duty. He never imagined that the medic might have a family, a life, a mother who had carried the pain of losing him. The words Lena had spoken echoed in Ethan's mind. "The medic was my son." David Walker. The name hung in the air like a question he hadn't known to ask. How had he not made the connection sooner? All these years he had carried around a story without knowing the truth. David Walker had been more than just a name on a list of casualties. He had been a person, an individual who had given his life for a cause bigger than himself. "I don't understand," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand how I didn't know. How did I never make the connection?" Lena's voice softened, almost as if she were speaking to herself as much as to him. "It wasn't something Jake spoke of openly. After everything that happened, I think it was too painful for him. And for me, it's not a story I tell often. But when I heard of your actions today, when I saw how you treated me simply because of who I am, I knew it was time for the truth to come out." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling deep within him. It wasn't just about the prejudice he had shown to Lena in the diner. It wasn't just about the casual cruelty that had been woven into his upbringing. It was about the deeper, more insidious ignorance that had blinded him from seeing the humanity in those around him, even when their fates had intersected in the most life-altering ways. "I'm sorry, Phil. I'm trying to help. I never thought about it like that," Ethan said quietly, his eyes flickering to the letter once more. "I never thought about the people behind the stories we tell. I never saw him as anything more than a medic, just a part of the story." Lena leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. "We all are, Ethan. Just parts of a bigger story. But the thing is, you have a choice. You can choose to see people for who they are, not just for who they're made out to be." She cocked her head. The silence between them felt heavier now, weighted with the enormity of the conversation. The noise of the diner seemed distant, as if the world had paused around them. Ethan could still hear the clinking of cutlery in the background, but it no longer held the same meaning. The familiar smells of greasy food and fresh coffee were muted, overshadowed by the heaviness in the air. The letter in his hand felt like a confession, a personal reckoning that had been long overdue. He hadn't just failed to see Lena for who she was. He had failed to see the countless others who had been placed into boxes, categorized by race, by status, by background. He had failed to see their stories, to hear their struggles, to understand the sacrifices they made. Lena's voice was gentle, yet firm. David believed in giving everything, no matter who it was for. And Jake, your brother, he was one of those people who understood that. He knew the price of a life saved. He knew the weight of a debt owed. Ethan could barely breathe, his chest tightening with the realization that he had been carrying around a burden of ignorance for far too long. It wasn't just Lena's pride or David's heroism that struck him now. It was the understanding that he, too, had been a part of the story, a part of the problem. And if he didn't change, if he didn't make the effort to truly see the people around him for who they were, then he would continue to live in a world of self-imposed blindness. I can't undo what I've done, Ethan said, his voice shaky. But I will try. I will do better. I'll listen. Lena smiled faintly, a sad but hopeful smile that didn't reach her eyes completely. That's all any of us can do, Ethan. Listen. And learn. As the moments passed, the gravity of Lena's words began to settle in, not just in his mind, but in his heart. He couldn't change the past, couldn't erase the mistakes of his youth, but he could shape his future. He could choose to look beyond the labels, beyond the surface, and see the real stories, the real people. He looked down at the letter again, his hands still trembling as he reread Jake's words about David. The medic who had risked everything, the medic who had given his life to save another. The man whose name he had failed to understand until now, the man who was not just a hero, but a son, a brother, a human being. With a deep breath, Ethan folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. He knew what he had to do next. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, each beat a reminder of the gap between the man he thought he was and the man he had just realized he had been. His mind felt like it was spinning out of control, caught in a whirlwind of emotions too complicated to unravel. He wanted to scream, to shut down, to escape, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The diner around him was fading away, distant and unimportant now. It was just him and the weight of the truth Lena had revealed. His father's voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if the man were standing right beside him, telling him to keep things simple, to know who your enemies are and stick with your own. It was the mantra that had shaped Ethan's worldview for years. His father had taught him that there were lines to be drawn, people to be avoided, and distinctions to be made. The world was easier to navigate when you kept it black and white, when you knew where everyone stood. But now, the lines weren't so clear. The walls his father had built in his mind were starting to crumble, one by one. And with each brick that fell, he felt more exposed, more vulnerable. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, not with all the contradictions that were suddenly rising to the surface. The words that Lena had spoken, the calm strength in her voice, the quiet pride she carried for her son, hung in the air like a challenge. She hadn't come to make him feel guilty. She had come to make him see, and she had succeeded. Ethan could see it now, the raw humanity of it all, the unfairness of how people had been categorized and dismissed. He had dismissed her, dismissed David, and in doing so he had betrayed a part of his own humanity. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. He could feel the weight of it in his chest, like something was suffocating him. The shame was so profound that it left him gasping for air. His father had never taught him how to handle shame, how to confront the ugliness of his own actions. All Ethan had known was how to defend himself, how to hide behind the rigid rules that had been instilled in him. His eyes dropped to the letter in his hands again, the paper now trembling in his grip. The words on the page seemed to blur, as if the ink itself could no longer hold the weight of the story they were telling. He thought about Jake, his brother, his hero. He had always admired Jake, had looked up to him as a soldier, a man who had been to war and come back changed. But now he realized his admiration had been one-dimensional. He had never considered the full scope of what Jake had gone through, or how the people around him, people like David, had shaped that experience. But it wasn't just about Jake. It wasn't just about David. It was about him, Ethan, the choices he had made, the things he had failed to see, the ways he had allowed his upbringing, his father's influence to blind him to the truth. He had never once questioned those lessons, never once looked beyond the surface of what he'd been taught. And now, the walls were coming down, and he had to face the consequences. As the silence dragged on, Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, a suffocating, oppressive force that seemed to seep into his very bones. His mind flickered back to the way he had reacted earlier, to how easily he had dismissed Lena as just another person to avoid, just another face that didn't belong in his world. How could he have been so blind? I didn't know, he muttered, more to himself than to Lena. His voice was thick with the realization. I didn't know it was him. I didn't know. Lena's gaze softened, her eyes no longer filled with the sharpness they had carried when she first walked in. You didn't know, Ethan, but now you do. She looked at Blue, unsure what to say. He clenched his fists in his lap, feeling the weight of his own self-loathing. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many ways he wanted to apologize, but the words seemed inadequate. Nothing he said could undo the years of ignorance, the casual cruelty, the judgment that had shaped his interactions with people like Lena. How could he ever make it right? How could he fix something that had been broken for so long? His mind flickered to his father again, to the man who had raised him to see the world in black and white terms. Ethan had never questioned those teachings. He had never questioned his father's beliefs or the way they had shaped his worldview. But now, standing in the light of the truth, he wondered if his father had been wrong. Was it possible that the man he had admired, the man who had shaped him into the person he was today, was wrong about everything? Ethan felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. How could he ever confront his father about this? How could he challenge everything he had been taught, everything that had been ingrained in him since childhood? He was just one man, one person, who had been shaped by forces far greater than himself. How could he undo it all? But then another thought struck him, a thought that caused the tightness in his chest to loosen just a little bit. Maybe the first step wasn't to undo everything. Maybe it wasn't about tearing down the past, but about making a choice to see, to listen, to learn, a choice to change, one step at a time. He glanced up at Lena, whose gaze had softened even further. She had seen him for what he was, but she hadn't come here to demand an apology. She had come to make him see, to make him understand. And now, for the first time, he felt like he was starting to understand. "I'll do better," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but steady. "I'll listen. I'll try to be better." Lena nodded, her eyes reflecting the quiet hope of someone who had seen more than her share of pain. "That's all we can do, Ethan. That's all we can ever do." And yet, the weight in Ethan's chest wasn't gone, but for the first time, it felt like something had shifted. Maybe it wasn't too late to change, to be better, to stop hiding behind the walls that had been built around him. Maybe it wasn't about perfect redemption, but about the courage to confront his own shortcomings and take the first step towards something new. The clinking of silverware and hushed murmurs ceased as Ethan's apology rang through the diner, his words hanging in the air like a long overdue release. The space around him felt charged, like the air had thickened with the weight of his confession. His heart raced, the rush of emotions overwhelming him. But the words, once spoken, felt like the first step toward healing. The silence stretched for a beat, and then, to Ethan's surprise, a few patrons, people he'd known his whole life, people he had never considered might be watching, began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, a scattering of hands meeting softly, unsure, but it quickly grew louder, spreading through the room like wildfire. Ethan's cheeks flushed as the applause built, and he looked down at the table, unsure how to handle the swell of emotion threatening to overtake him. Lena's gaze remained steady, watching him with an expression that was hard to read. There was no triumph in her eyes, no sense of victory. Just a quiet, steady acknowledgement, as if this moment of reckoning was simply part of the long road to understanding. And the applause didn't stop. The patrons of Joe's diner, each with their own story, each with their own pain and regrets, were acknowledging his vulnerability, recognizing his courage to face what he had never allowed himself to see before. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight as he took a deep breath. "I know words aren't enough," he continued, the tremor in his voice betraying the depths of his inner turmoil. "But I have to start somewhere. I have to make things right. For David, for my brother, for all of you." The noise in the diner softened slightly as those around him listened, some still clapping, others simply watching him with quiet understanding. He caught sight of a few familiar faces, his old high school teacher, the woman who ran the bakery, even the elderly couple who came in every Sunday for breakfast. They were all here, all witnessing this moment, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the weight of his own role in their lives. Lena's voice broke through the reverence in the air, steady and clear. "Thank you, Ethan. That's all anyone could ask for." His eyes flicked up to meet hers. She didn't offer a grand gesture, no over-the-top praise, just a simple acknowledgement that felt more meaningful than any applause. It was a reminder that redemption didn't come in grandiose gestures. It came in the quiet moments of honesty, of facing one's own flaws and making a choice to change. Ethan took another deep breath, letting the applause wash over him for just a moment longer before he slowly made his way back to his station. His hands were still trembling, but there was a lightness in his chest, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. As he passed Lena's table, he stopped for a moment, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady now. "For showing me." Lena nodded, her expression softening. "It's not about thanks, Ethan. It's about learning. We all have to learn." With that, Ethan returned to his work, his mind racing but his heart a little less burdened. The diner was still the same, a small, cozy corner of the world, but for Ethan, everything had changed. And as he moved through the rest of his shift, something inside him shifted too, as if the first real change in his life had begun. In the desolate room, he relit his cigarette and took a deep breath. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the quiet streets of the small town. It felt like a new beginning, not just for Ethan, but for everyone who had witnessed the moment. In the stillness of that diner, with all its imperfections, the possibility of redemption had been made real. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. Lena's smile was small, but it carried a weight that Ethan had never before known. Her gaze never wavered, and in her eyes there was no resentment, only a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her every word. "Apologies are a start, Ethan," she said softly, her voice low but filled with the kind of authority that made him lean forward just slightly, as though every syllable had to be absorbed with intention. "But actions are what matter. Make better choices. Be better." Ethan felt the words pierce through him with such force that it left him momentarily breathless. He wanted to respond, to say something, anything to show that he understood, truly understood, what she was asking of him. But the truth was, he didn't know where to begin. His apology had been a first step, yes, but Lena's reminder stung in a way that left him raw. She wasn't asking for promises. She wasn't asking for grand gestures or empty words. She was asking for the kind of change that went beyond the surface, the kind that rippled outward through every part of his life, from the way he saw others to the way he treated them. More than that, the room had quieted again, but it wasn't the kind of uncomfortable silence that had filled the space earlier. This time it was different, still, almost reverent. People had stopped clapping, but no one moved. The faces around him held a sense of anticipation, as if they too were waiting for the next moment of reckoning. And in that silence, Lena's words became an echo in his mind, bouncing between his thoughts like an unrelenting drumbeat. Make better choices. Be better. The weight of those words grew heavier with each passing second. Ethan knew it wasn't just about race or prejudice. It wasn't about apologizing to Lena and then moving on. It was about examining the way he had lived, the way he had let himself be shaped by old beliefs, old wounds, and a fear of looking at the world differently. For the first time, the walls that had kept him isolated, walls he'd built out of fear, anger, and ignorance, seemed insurmountable. Lena was asking him to tear those walls down, and in their place, she was asking him to build something more meaningful, more compassionate. But how? Where did he even begin? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the room on his shoulders. Everyone was watching, waiting. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but in the pit of his stomach, he knew there was no going back. He had taken the first step by acknowledging his wrongs. The next, the more difficult one, was to live out the change he had promised. Lena stood slowly, her movements deliberate. There was a finality in her posture, but no bitterness. Just the quiet assurance of someone who had already weathered life's storms and knew that justice, real justice, came from a commitment to action, not just words. She placed a hand on the table, then gave him one last look, the faintest trace of a smile still playing at the corners of her lips. "Remember, Ethan," she said, her voice steady, "the real change begins when you stop looking at the world through the lens of your past. You have to see it with new eyes. Everyone deserves that." The police presence became even stronger, cutting off their view of the front door. Her gaze lingered for a moment longer, then she turned and walked toward the door. Ethan stood there, rooted in place, unable to tear his eyes away from her retreating figure. The hum of conversation had picked up again, but it felt distant, muffled, as though the entire diner had shifted with Lena's departure. Ethan's thoughts were still tangled in the web of her words. He had never considered himself to be a man of actions, at least not in the way she meant. He had always followed the rules, followed what was expected of him, lived according to his father's rigid expectations. But now, those old beliefs seemed like a far-off echo, a part of his life he could no longer rely on. He glanced around the diner, at the familiar faces, the people who had witnessed his apology and had offered their applause. He felt different now, as if the air in the room had cleared. There was a stillness in his chest, the kind that comes with finally facing what had been buried for too long. But he knew the real challenge had only just begun. Ethan's gaze shifted back to the door where Lena had just exited. Her words still rang in his ears, and he felt the faintest stir of resolve. She had given him a gift that came without expectation, but one that demanded action nonetheless. She had made it clear that the road to redemption wasn't just about admitting fault. It was about changing how he saw the world, how he moved through it, and how he treated others. As he turned back to his station, Ethan let out a long, steadying breath. The work ahead of him wouldn't be easy, but he had taken the first step, and for the first time he felt ready to face what was next, not just for himself, but for others too. The journey ahead would be his to navigate, but with every choice, he knew he would be writing a new story, one defined by empathy, by understanding, and by the courage to be better. Lena had shown him the path. Now it was up to him to walk it. As Lena's figure disappeared into the brisk afternoon air, Ethan remained by the door, his hand resting on the cool metal frame, staring into the space she had just occupied. The bells above the diner's entrance jingled again as the doors swung shut, but the silence that followed felt weightier than any noise could ever be. Ethan's heart was still pounding, the weight of the conversation, the apology, and Lena's words pressing against his chest. He could feel the slow burn of shame and clarity melding together inside him. His entire worldview had been turned upside down, and for the first time, he felt a stirring deep inside, a desire to change, to make things right. He glanced around the diner, the familiar faces of his co-workers and regular patrons blurred at the edges. They didn't know what had just transpired, what kind of transformation had begun in him, but the air in the room felt different. It was as if something had shifted, not just in him, but in the very fabric of the space around him. Ethan felt the stirrings of a new purpose, a path he knew he needed to walk, one he had never imagined himself taking. He had lived so much of his life according to the rigid lines his father had drawn, his brother's expectations, and his town's unspoken rules. But Lena had shattered those walls in a matter of minutes with a few simple words: fairness, justice, action. She had shown him that redemption wasn't a single moment of recognition, but a continual process, built on each choice made with integrity. His eyes settled on the empty booth where Lena had sat. He saw the crumpled letter that she had left behind, the one that had revealed to him the profound truth about his brother's survival. It was in that moment that Ethan truly realized just how deep the cycle of prejudice ran. His family's history, his father's entrenched beliefs, had all conditioned him to believe that certain people were somehow less deserving, less worthy. But Lena had taught him that courage, honor, and sacrifice knew no color, no boundary, and no place. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the soft clink of a cup being set down on the counter. He looked up to see one of the regulars, old Mr. Thompson, eyeing him with a knowing gaze. The elderly man had been a constant fixture at Joe's diner for as long as Ethan could remember, always there for coffee and a chat. "You all right, son?" Mr. Thompson's voice was slow, the kind of voice that didn't rush to fill the space, but lingered with a gentle weight. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. He wasn't sure how to explain what had just happened, how to articulate the shifting tide within him. But the old man didn't press him further. Instead, he gave a small, understanding nod. "No cabinetry. You've got a long road ahead of you, I think," Mr. Thompson said quietly, not unkindly, as he took his seat at the counter. Ethan wasn't sure if he was talking about the diner, his job, or something else entirely. But in that moment, Ethan understood. The journey ahead of him was not just about confronting the past. It was about how he chose to move forward. how he chose to live in the present and build a better future. He knew he had a lot to make up for. He knew that the first step would be the hardest, changing the way he had seen the world for so long. But what Lena had done for him, the gift she had given him in those simple words, was a gift he could not ignore. She had opened his eyes, and with it, a whole new way of living had become possible. The diner had grown busier now, but Ethan's mind remained focused on what had just happened. He couldn't let it slip away. He couldn't go back to who he was before. His every movement now felt deliberate, as though he was aware of the new weight of responsibility he carried. He picked up the order pad once again, but this time he did it with a sense of purpose, of something deeper than routine. The conversation with Lena would forever be etched in his mind, and though he hadn't been able to change everything in that one moment, he now understood that change was not instantaneous. It was earned, and it was sustained with each decision made. He could no longer view people through the narrow lens of fear and judgment. It was time to see them through who they truly were, their worth, their humanity. Ethan took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and moved toward the next table. The weight of the choices ahead of him settling into his bones like something he had always known, yet never truly acknowledged. They knew he was afraid of death. They knew he was naturally afraid of dying. He had no use for fears like that. This was his new beginning,